I don't know. Does this work? Does it work? Thank you very much, Ann. I appreciate those comments. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today. I've always found, and when I say I've always found, for a very large part of my life, because as Ann said, when my history with Montessori started, I was alarmingly young. So for a very large part of my life, I have met wonderful people who have selected themselves into a particular group, the Montessori group. These are Montessori parents, they're Montessori administrators, they're Montessori teachers in training, they're seasoned Montessori folks, they are Montessori teacher trainers. They're all kinds of versions, if you will, of interest in Montessori, but all of these people are bound by a common vision. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. I want to share with you immediately the fact that I'm very mindful that you are going to be exposed to 6 unrelenting hours of my presence, which is about the equivalent of a school day. So I promise recess. The outset, all right? And I'm going to more or less divide the day into 4 segments, because that will make it a little more palatable, and there'll be things for you to do, because how could we have a Montessori meeting without involving more than the person who is in charge in the enterprise. So don't despair. As soon as I make my introductory remarks, there'll be a little activity for you to engage in, and that will focus your attention, and hopefully it will also commit you to carrying through the task with the kind of purpose that we think of as appropriate to Montessori folks, okay? I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the American Montessori experience, which at its very beginnings was, in a sense, my experience. It would be very presumptuous to imply that it was my experience other than at the beginning. But there was a time when the name Montessori evoked one of 2 responses in people. This is back, we're talking 40 years ago. People thought Maria Montessori was either an aging Italian soprano or an antipasto. They really didn't know who she was. And this was curious, because Montessori died in 1952, just about the time that I began working in the American Montessori movement. And it was curious because most people believed that Montessori somehow belonged back in the 19th century somewhere. She died the same year John Dewey did, the American educational philosopher. But Montessori's work had been most notably accomplished, as far as the public was concerned, around the first decade of the 20th century. So in a sense, she was a bit like Winston Churchill in that she outlived her great work, as far as people knew. And so when she died, many people were surprised that she was alive. And there's no disrespect to Montessori, but it's an important point. I became involved in interest in Montessori as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, Canada, more years ago than I care to admit, but if you do your mental arithmetic, you're going to figure all this out. This was in the late 40s. I had a psychology professor who was extremely interested in Montessori's ideas, and he said, you know, here is someone who combines insights of perennial philosophy with real global outreach. This is not an Italian educator. This is a global educator. Here's someone who really understands something about the nature of children and the nature of learning that has not, up to this point in time, really had an adequate hearing on the North American continent. And it's had a very modest hearing in Europe. And Europe is proportionally far smaller than America, so Montessori education proportionally probably made a much larger impact in Europe than it had, up until the late 40s in America. Okay? So he said, you might be interested in looking at this woman's work. And that's how I became interested in Montessori. I read her stuff, which is not easy, as all of you know. E.B. White, the humorist, says, some people's work suffers not in the translation, but in the original. Montessori is that sort of person when you read her stuff. Right? It's florid. It's Italianate. you have to work very hard to get to the core of it. But this would be insurmountable if there were not also a living tradition from people who worked with Montessori, from people who have worked in Montessori settings, who in fact are interpreting and reframing what Montessori wrote in ways that make sense to the hearer. So I don't in any way want to disparage Montessori, please understand that. But she was difficult as a writer. Or alternatively, she may have been clear as a bell, but her translators were extremely fussy. Don't know, right? We do know that her American translator, Andy George, who translated the Montessori method, was head of the Washington Montessori School, and in 1919, she was one of the founders of the Progressive Education Association, which was a group in America that was trying to look at public and private education from a new perspective. So actually, the Montessori folks were very much involved in educational thinking in America, even though they didn't come forward with their Montessori labels the way we might have expected that they would do. Montessori herself, as many of you know, though perhaps not all, came to America several times, right? She first of all, let me give you some dates. Montessori was born in 1870, okay? Died in 1952. Right? She finished medical school in 1896. When she finished medical school as a young doctor, she was the first woman doctor in Italy. I mean, there had been women doctors in Germany. Italy was a little behind the times, so women were admitted to medical school later. But Montessori was the first woman physician. There weren't a lot of positions open to a female doctor, so she became a school visitor. And what she saw when she visited the Roman public schools was that there were 3 diseases children could get from just being in school. First of all, they could get curvature of the spine because they were seated in desks, which were, part where the seats and the desks were part of the same unit, and these were nailed to the floor, and the children were metaphorically nailed to the desks. Okay? So if you were a size 16 and you had a size 8 desk, you could be permanently crippled. All right? She also saw that you could get tuberculosis from breathing the fetid air. These schools were very poorly ventilated. Remember, this is a doctor who really understood that children needed a healthy environment, all children. And then she also believed you could get a permanent squint from attempting to look at blackboards where the writing was almost indecipherable because the lighting was so bad. So Montessori, as a kind of school visitor, came back and she said to the Roman public school folks, what we're doing here is we are impeding the normal growth of children. I mean, actually, Montessori, when she was talking about younger children, said not children don't learn through movement, children learn as movement. Whereas in American education, we often say, watch that child is moving. And we have this notion that silence and immobility and virtue are somehow all mixed together. Now, Montessori didn't have that point of view, particularly where preschoolers were concerned.